Hi everyone, this is Dr. Wayne E. Wright from Purdue University. And as I'm sure you're aware, No Child Left Behind is coming to an end and is being replaced by the Every Student Succeeds Act. And there's a lot of questions in terms of, well, what does this mean for English language learners? And so in this presentation, I'll take you through what we know so far about the ESSA and what those implications for English learners will be. Let me go ahead and pull up a presentation here, and I'll go ahead and walk you through this. So first, some background. The Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 is the latest reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Now, when ESSA was in the form of No Child Left Behind, it was actually long overdue for reauthorization. In fact, it should have been reauthorized soon after President Obama took office. And there was wide bipartisan acknowledgement that No Child Left Behind was deeply flawed, had fallen far short of its goals to close the achievement gap, and it never did reach that magic day in 2014 when all students, 100% of students, would be passing state math and reading tests. And however, Congress made little efforts to reauthorize or fix it for many years. So as a result, the Obama administration essentially worked around Congress to try to instigate some of its own education reforms. And so first, it was done through the economic stimulus funding that provided millions of more dollars in funding, especially for Title I schools. But also some of the things that came out of the Obama administration's education reform efforts included college career readiness standards and assessments, and then having corresponding English language proficiency standards and assessments. The requirement that teacher evaluations be tied to their student test scores, and the encouragement or the incentives for states to adopt the Common Core state standards and assessments. So after years of doing nothing, suddenly at the end of 2015, Congress finally passed this new reauthorization of the ESSA, called the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so it was on December 2nd, 2015, that it passed in the House of Representatives. And then a few days later, the next week in the U.S. Senate, it passed on December 9th. And then the next day, it was signed by President Obama on December 10th in 2015. Again, it was passed by wide margins with strong bipartisan support. And so 2016 to 2017 will be the transition year from No Child Left Behind to ESSA. And then full implementation of the ESSA will take place starting in the 2017-2018 school year. Now, it's important to note that the negotiated rulemaking process is still underway, and so many of the details are yet to be worked out. But I will go over some of the general principles that are outlined in the law itself. So first, the requirements for standards remain essentially the same. States must adopt challenging state academic standards. However, what's new is the requirement that they must be aligned with entrance examinations for credit-bearing coursework in the system of public higher education in the state and relevant career and technical education standards. So this long sentence is basically the same thing as saying they need to be college and career readiness standards. But I thought it was interesting that they took efforts not to use that exact phrase. Now, the testing regimen remains exactly the same. There has to be annual testing in English language arts/reading and in math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. And then science has to be tested at least once in elementary, middle, and high school. The requirements for separate subgroups for accountability purposes essentially remains the same. So this includes our major racial and ethnic groups, economically disadvantaged students, children with disabilities, gender, and then the English language learners subgroup. Now, it does specify that former ELLs who have been redesignated as fluent English proficient may continue to be counted in the ELL subgroup for up to 4 years. And this is significant because prior to that, it was only 2 years. And so the idea being that including former ELLs in the subgroup will prevent it from looking like the ELL subgroup is not making any progress. All right, and also significant in the ESSA was this elimination of the idea of super subgroups, where under ESSA flexibility, many states had said, well, we're just going to take all these subgroups and put them together into one big super subgroup. Many civil rights organizations were not happy with that because that was essentially a way of masking the unique needs of students in these specific categories. And so they were quite happy to see this subgroup accountability restored under ESSA. Okay, so there's a lot more flexibility afforded to states. First and most significantly is that the adequate yearly progress system of accountability has been eliminated. Okay? States now have a lot more flexibility to establish their own accountability system, to set their own goals, both long-term and short-term, and how they're going to intervene in low-performing schools. Now, whatever plan that the state comes up with, they have to submit that to the U.S. Department of Education. It'll go through some peer review process, and it has to be approved in order for the state to begin to carry out that plan. When the state develops its accountability plan, it has to consider at least 4 factors. First, of course, is the student's proficiency on state tests, in other words, student test scores. Then, and this is significant and new, they have to consider the student's level of English proficiency in the case of English language learners. Then there has to be some other academic factor that's considered, such as the student's growth over time, or perhaps the graduation rates at a high school. And then there has to be at least one other 4th factor, which is not necessarily academic in nature. So it could be, for example, levels of student and teacher engagement, the school climate and safety, or the amount of access students have to advanced placement courses. The idea of this other indicator is to give us some kind of idea of the student's opportunity to learn in a particular school. It remains to be seen yet how that's going to be measured and how it's going to be included, but that is a part of the school's accountability plans. And also somewhere in the plan, the state needs to address how they're going to ensure at least 95% of the students participate on the state assessments. When it comes to intervening in low-performing schools, ESSA requires that the states intervene in the bottom 5% of schools, but they also have to intervene in any high school where the graduation rate is less than 67%. Now, at the school and the district level, for schools, they have to pay attention to how the different subgroups are doing, and if any one of those subgroups is struggling, the school has to create a plan detailing how they're going to intervene and help the students in that subgroup. So, for example, if ELLs are struggling, then the school has to come up with a specific plan on how they're going to help ELLs. Then at the district level, they have to monitor their schools, and they have to intervene and create a plan for their lowest performing schools. Now, if these schools continue to struggle after 4 years, then the state can take over. They could take over the school, they could fire the principal, they could convert it to a charter school, or whatever else the state comes up with. Another significant change in terms of what was happening under Race to the Top and the ESSA flexibility is that now there's no longer a requirement to tie test scores to teacher evaluations. And in another kind of direct rebuke to the Obama administration, the ESSA states clearly that the U.S. Secretary of Education cannot force or encourage states to adopt the Common Core or really any other standards assessments or to join any particular partnerships. So that still means that the states are free to adopt these if they want, but it really decreases the power of the Secretary of Education in having any kind of influence in that area. Okay, and continuing on in terms of flexibility of assessment, states actually have a couple of options now. One is they can continue to administer the state assessments through a single summative assessment, meaning at the end of the year, the students take this big test, or they could have multiple statewide interim assessments during the course of the academic year that result in a single summative score. And that must provide valid and reliable and transparent information on student achievement or growth. So instead of one big test at the end of the year, they could have several individual tests throughout the year and then just combine those towards the end. Some other ways of flexibility. It says that the accountability systems may include measures of student academic growth, so they can compare how they did with the previous year to the current year and include that in their accountability system. It may partially be delivered in the form of portfolios, projects, or extended performance tests. And it may use computer adaptive assessments. That means that the students could be taking a test on the computer that includes items that are both below and above grade level, and depending on how they're doing on the test, the computer would adjust it to be either easier or more difficult, consistent with the performance of the student. So these are all some possibilities that states now have an option to explore and experiment with. Now, when it comes to including English language learners, as before, ELLs must be included in state academic assessments. They must be assessed in a valid and reliable manner, and they must be provided with appropriate accommodations to the extent practicable. And this includes assessments in the language and form most likely to yield accurate data on what students know and can do in academic content areas until such students have achieved English language proficiency. In other words, we got to provide accommodations until they're fluent enough in English that they no longer need them. And then it specifies that ELLs attending U.S. schools for less than 3 consecutive years may be assessed in a language other than English or in another form. And that can also be extended to 2 additional years if the student has not yet attained a level of English proficiency that would allow them to be assessed in a valid and reliable manner. So this is essentially the same as it was under No Child Left Behind, where up to 5 years of testing the native language can be allowed. But also when it specifies or in another form, that could be, for example, a linguistically simplified form of the test. All right, so this is a little bit new. When it comes to including ELLs and accountability formulas, the first option, option A, is essentially what we currently have in our No Child Behind, and that is that English language learners' test scores are included only after they've been in the country for 1 year. However, ESSA provides an option B. So during the first year that ELL students are in the U.S., they would be required to take both the reading and the math test, and their test scores would have to be reported to the public. However, their scores would not count towards the school's rating. In the second year, the state must incorporate the ELL scores for both reading and math, but rather than just looking at their raw scores or their scale scores, they would look at some kind of measure of their growth. And so how did they do last year, and then how well did they do the following year after a year of instruction. And then in the third year, ELL test scores will be treated just like any other students and fully accounted for in the accountability system. The requirements for English language proficiency standards and assessments are similar, but a significant change is that they've been moved from Title III to Title I. And so, as before, the states have to have English language proficiency standards. They have to be aligned with the state's challenging academic standards. They have to cover listening, speaking, reading, and writing. They have to address different proficiency levels. And when it comes to accountability on these assessments, states and schools have to keep track of the students' progress in learning English and keep track of the students' progress in actually attaining English proficiency. And then the state plans would have to specify goals for those 2 specific areas. So some other requirements specific to English language learners. Districts and states must report additional data such as how are ELL students with disabilities performing, and also keeping track of long-term English language learners. And that means English language learners who maybe after 5 years or more have not yet been reclassified as a fluent English proficient student. States must establish consistent standards to determine when students are required to receive ELL services. In other words, how do we identify which students are ELLs and then provide them the services? And then when students can be exited from those services. Title III is still part of ESSA, but what remains from after they took all that other stuff and put it into Title I, what remains mostly focuses on funding and support for language instruction education programs, and for monitoring and reporting the requirements on the progress of ELLs in meeting state standards. So it's still there, but in a little bit different form. So what are the implications for English language learners? First, there's a lot of things here to make ELL advocates quite happy and feel positive about. First, and significant, is that we're no longer using the LEP term, limited English proficient. That's been struck out and replaced with English learners, which is a much more positive and not a deficit view of the students. Removal of unrealistic expectations like 100% of ELLs ultimately passing the state test in any given year. Having requirements for an ELL subgroup, again, means that the ELL students can't be ignored, and especially now that we've moved English language proficiency from Title III to Title I, and making that a part of the school's overall accountability, really raises the bar for schools to make sure that they are meeting the needs of their English language learners. So many see that as a positive. And of course, there's a lot more flexibility in terms of what the goals will be, especially in terms of what the goals might be, in particular for English language learners at different levels of English proficiency, and the interventions. And so, again, people are excited about the fact that at the school level, they have to pay attention to these subgroups, and if the ELLs are struggling, they have to come up with a very specific plan on how to meet their needs. There's some relief from ELL test scores and school accountability formulas for the first 2 years, whereas before, it was only 1 year, which everyone recognizes was not sufficient. Another big victory is that teacher evaluations will no longer be tied to invalid ELL test scores. And so this could mean that teachers are less afraid to have English language learners in their classroom because they won't necessarily impact their evaluations or their pay raises. And then also there's some consideration for the students' English language proficiency in these accountability programs, including some considerations of their growth over time in both their language knowledge and their content knowledge. And so there's a lot of potential there for really coming up with more reasonable goals under these accountability systems for English language learners. Now, all that said, there are, of course, some remaining large concerns. First and foremost, ESSA still has a primary focus on school reform through the use of standards and high-stakes testing. Okay, even with all those other factors considered, it really boils down to test scores. And as we've seen from No Child Behind and even before that, school reform through high-stakes testing and accountability has so far failed. So are we just continuing some of the same failed policies as before? All the validity and reliability issues and the issues of ineffective accommodations when it comes to including English language learners in high-stakes tests has not been resolved. And so we continue to move forward without really a good understanding of how to include them in a valid and reliable manner. And yes, it's nice to have now 3 years before their scores totally count, but is 3 years really sufficient if we know that it can take anywhere from 4 to 10 years for ELLs to catch up to their English proficient peers? The inclusion of ELLs in the former ELLs in the ELL subgroup for up to 4 years could be a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing, meaning that it could artificially inflate the performance of the ELL subgroup and thus mask the actual needs and the struggles of current ELL students. So some people are concerned about that. And then there's no recognition throughout the entire text of the ESSA document. There is no recognition and no encouragement for the development of bilingualism and biliteracy. The exclusive focus is on English. Okay? And this is in contrast to the ESSA prior to No Child Behind, when there was explicit encouragement through the Bilingual Education Act in Title VII and recognizing the societal values of bilingualism. So that has not been restored under ESSA. And finally, there are still many, many unknowns about implementation. There's going to be a lot of debates as the negotiated rulemaking takes place, and the devil is going to be in the details. But I, for one, overall remain somewhat optimistic. I think that now the states have a lot more flexibility in terms of trying some truly innovative things that could really be much more better for not just English language learners, but for all students. And of course, the new processes in place that are really going to require schools and districts and teachers to really pay attention to English language learners, to be more attuned to the types of curriculum and instruction and programs that are going to be designed to help them to be more successful. So again, there's going to be lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities. So I think it's important for those of us who have expertise and licensure in this area that we have an active voice at the school and at the state levels as these policies are being developed, and to make sure that ELLs are being treated fairly and are being successful under this new system. All right, thank you very much.